Let's go ahead and get started, and then just to give people a lay of the land. I'll be doing a 5 to 10 minute introduction. We'll then turn it over to Murray Stein and Bernard Sartorius in Zurich. They'll do a 3-hour lecture with a break as well as questions during that time frame. We'll do a 1-hour lunch break. Now, lunch is relative. Could be dinner if you're in Zurich. It might be a late brunch in California. For us, it will be a late lunch. There will be a meal break in 3 hours from now. And then we'll come back for a 2-hour block, from Tom Singer out of Sonoma State University. But we'll all be interacting throughout this time. The majority of people watching today are actually in the internet land. We have relatively small hardwired sites today. We have Zurich, of course, Asheville, Sonoma, maybe a few in Wilmington, but we have 100 to 150 throughout the world joining us from the internet. So this is the first time we've had such a broad internet exposure. They'll be interacting through email. So you'll see many of the questions will come from me. If I juggle my email correctly, that'll be right from my monitor here, and then we'll ask the questions to Tom, Bernard, and Murray live from the internet emailed questions. I wanted to let people know the countries joining us today. Yet again, we're very pleased to have such a broad international gathering today. The 14 countries included are Australia, Brazil, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, India, Japan, Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, United Kingdom, and the United States. And most of these countries, there's numerous people from those countries. There's not just one or two in each one, but I was impressed of 5 to 10, even 15 in many of these countries. So we're really broadening into the global community. That's really our vision. Our vision of the Asheville Jung Center is to have a growing global community, and we're seeing more and more evidence of that happening. People from around the world coming together. I was in Montreal, Canada, just 2 weeks ago, as was all our presenters. Murray Stein, Bernard Sartorius, Tom Singer, and I all were in Montreal for a large conference. And I can't tell you how many people came up to me and said, "Steve, thank you so much for the work you're doing. I live in Brazil or I live in Russia, and I love being able to connect in with your projects." And that's what we're moving towards. We would love to keep growing in that community. The ways we're interacting are, of course, by live seminars, and that's what you're seeing right now. We're doing a live 5-hour seminar. People can hook in with their home computers or go to group sites and join us for those seminars. We like to have them as interactive as possible, meaning that if you're in a live site, we'll be asking for questions. If you're at a home site, then you may email us questions, and we'll read them to the presenters. But we want to have a sense of engagement from the audience with this. The other way to participate are recorded seminars. Each of these seminars are recorded. They'll be available online for a 2 to 3 week period. After that, after about 3 months, they'll be authored into DVDs that can be purchased through the website as well. So if you're not able to watch it live, they're usually on Fridays. A lot of people work on that schedule. You can either watch the 2 to 3 week window on the internet, or you can purchase the DVD later on. So we do want to make these broadly available. We are making a foray into social media, so you'll see more Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, blogging. A lot of us are past the generation of that, but myself included. But many of us aren't, and you'll see more and more people engaging with the blog, with comments on it, with Twitter, with Facebook, etc. So we're pleased to grow the community in that way. Do check out the weekly blog. It's on our main website, and we do try to really put some substance into that whenever possible. Would like to highlight our next seminar. We're planning to do one in November, and then a couple in early 2011, which we're still in the planning stages of. The one on, I believe, November 5th is going to be a Friday as well. Will be from Murray Stein and Andreas Schweitzer, who wrote a recent book on the sun god's journey through the netherworld. It's just looking at Egyptian mythology and how the sun god's descent into the depths of the underworld parallels an individuation symbol, in essence. Very excited for that. That'll be right about 2 months from now. And we'll be sending out emails. We haven't yet, but we'll get those out soon to people. A couple quick other pieces before we introduce our speakers briefly. One is the necessary thank yous, and I won't go through the whole list. Often there'll be 20 to 30 people to thank for this, but I would like to highlight a few. One is UNCA and the NC Run system. University of North Carolina, Asheville is where I'm at right now, as well as 10 or so people in the room. That's our hub. That's where we broadcast these from, and we're using the Department of Psychology's resources as well as distance learning and NC Run, and they allow us to hub this out to web stream systems around the world. So we really want to thank them for that. Sonoma State University, who I think I'm looking at right now in the monitor, is one of our partners today as well. They're hosting Tom Singer, who's a member of the San Francisco Young Institute, and they'll be our afternoon presenters. We want to thank Laura McCabe and Tom and the many people there for their efforts in helping us really double the seminar. It was going to be a quick 3-hour seminar, and now we added a whole second half to that. I want to thank our filmmaker, which you'll hear some about later, Peter Hedges, and I might be not saying his last name correctly, but Tom will correct us later on that. But Peter has put together a pretty remarkable film. We're not going to watch the whole film. You'll see about 5, maybe 10 minutes of it later this afternoon. But it's a very striking film. We want to thank Peter for his work with that. That film will be released in its entirety later on, and I'll make sure to get an email out to people to let them know when the film is available and how to access that if possible. But you'll see that in this afternoon's presentation. Quick thanks to the Philmon Foundation. They have just been universal in getting Jung's words out more to the published community, and we want to thank them. And lastly, ISAP Zurich. ISAP stands for the International School of Analytical Psychology, and you'll hear that again when I introduce Marie Stein in a moment. ISAP has supported us through this whole venture and has loaned us their chief analysts, their senior analysts, Marie Stein being the president there, and we really thank ISAP for their support of this project. Okay, a few quick housekeeping pieces before we turn the mic over. First of all, as you're probably sick of getting warned, please turn off cell phones. Cell phones do get picked up, particularly on these mics. So when a cell phone goes off, it really derails the system for a moment or two. So put them on vibrate if you don't mind. Number two, it may be obvious, but I'm going to warn people anyway. This is being taped. This is a recorded seminar. The recordings will be available for people to watch later on. That means if you're a highly introverted person and do not wish to be on tape, please don't appear in front of the camera asking a question, because that image most likely will end up on the DVD later on. Most people don't mind to be on the tape, and if you're one of those, feel free to ask the question directly with that. Questions. If you're in the internet world and you have a question you'd like me to ask the presenter, that question should be emailed to seminar@ashevilleyoungcenter.org. Seminar@ashevilleyoungcenter.org. Now you already have that information. It's posted on the website, and it was an email I sent to you yesterday. So just look at that email and you can cut and paste that. I will go through as many of the questions as I can. Obviously, we'll probably be limited and probably won't answer them all, but we'll do our best to ask as many as possible. We will have one break during the 3-hour seminar shortly, and that'll be approximately halfway in between. But if you need to use the restroom or get a drink of water or exit during the program, feel free, both here in Asheville and I'm assuming in Sonoma State as well. And please do give us feedback. So if you like something or don't like something of today, send us an email, and that email address is on the web as well. So let me tell you briefly about Maurice Stein. You've heard me introduce him a number of times over the last 2 years. I'll say briefly that Murray is the current president of the International School of Analytical Psychology, ISAP, Zurich, and he is a senior analyst in there as well. Murray is an ordained Presbyterian minister. He is a founding member of 2 different Jungian institutes. He's a very gifted teacher, and you'll see that today. He's been one of our most sought-after teachers that can really bring these Jungian concepts to a broad audience in a very clear but in-depth way. He's published quite a bit. His recent book is called Jungian Psychoanalysis, just released last week, I believe. Excellent book. He's edited numerous other authors that have pulled their materials together. There's different world-leading experts of various analytical bends, and they've written chapters within that book. So if you get a chance, take a look at that. I would highly recommend it. Bernard Sartorius is also a ISAP senior training analyst. He is an ordained Swiss Protestant minister. He has practices in Geneva and Zurich, and he has written and traveled extensively talking about the polarities between Islam and the Western world, and obviously that's going to be a big theme of today's talk as well. Tom Singer I'll introduce in the afternoon, but you'll hear some from Tom. He's a psychiatrist and analyst from San Francisco, but I'll formally introduce Tom when we kick his presentation off this afternoon. So, without further ado, I now turn you over to Murray Stein and Bernard Sartorius in Zurich, Switzerland.
Thanks, Steve. Bernard is sitting right here beside me. I'll introduce him in a little bit when it's his turn to make his presentation. And our plan is to divide this 3 hours that we have into 3 parts. That I will do the first part until roughly 6 o'clock our time. I guess that's 12 o'clock your time there in Asheville. Leaving about 10 minutes toward the end of that for questions. Bernard will then do his presentation for the following 45 minutes, take some questions, and then we'll have a break. Following the break, he and I will enter into a dialogue about some of the things that we've presented. We'll also invite Tom Singer to ask some questions from Sonoma, and anybody else who would like to join us at that time for a more or less free-floating, improvised discussion. So I would like to thank you, Steve, for the inspiration to bring this topic to our seminar, to enlarge our vision from the individual working in psychoanalysis or in therapy with individuals. We did the 4 pillars of the Jungian approach to psychotherapy. We've also discussed the Red Book, which is a story of Jung's own personal individuation process at midlife. And now we're going to try to see to what extent some of the concepts that Jung originated and that other Jungians have used in their own personal lives, in their practices, to think about other issues, larger issues, social issues, political issues, even world historical issues. The topic that Steve and I came up with was symbols and individuation in global politics and leadership, the case of Barack Obama. And some of these terms, I'll try to give some description and definition of some of these terms, such as symbols, individuation, and leadership from a Jungian perspective in my section starting this seminar. And I think I'll probably not touch on Barack Obama so much, maybe just in passing. Certainly the other 2 presenters will focus much more on the specific topic, the case of Barack Obama, both as a symbol and as a politician, a world leader. But I want to talk about more general issues, a more general theoretical perspective on politics and leadership and what's going on in the world today from a Jungian perspective. And I want to begin by just telling a little story about how I got involved in Jungian psychology at the beginning, because it was through a political question, actually. It wasn't through a personal question or through a clinical question at all, or a theological question, which has been a great interest of mine all my life, but really a political question. I was at a party on a Sunday afternoon in Washington, D.C. in 1968. And 1968 was a very hot year in American politics, as you know, and Washington was the center of it. And there was a great deal of agitation in the collective, in the society, with regard to 2 issues, civil rights being one and the Vietnam War the other. And people of my generation, I was in my early 20s at that time, were very concerned, especially about the war in Vietnam, because we might be drafted and sent over there, risk our lives. And the question was, is it worth it? Is it worth shedding your blood, your own personal life, for the sake of a war that seemed very questionable? And so all the questions that were raised about the United States' involvement in Vietnam were very topical at that time. And at this party, I told the friends who were there that I'd been reading a book on it's called The Territorial Imperative. Robert Ardrey had written this book, and I was reading it, and it had to do with the human instinct to defend their territories, and that and this was a study derived also from etymology and animal studies featuring apes and baboons, as well as human beings defending their territory. And so this idea of territoriality as being the source of warfare. Why do human beings go to war? Why are wars so endemic in human history? Was really my question. That's what I was trying to research and trying to figure out. And Robert Ardrey's book was very interesting. Anyway, I put this on the table at this party, and a woman named Betty O'Connor was there, and she said, well, you really ought to read Jung sometime on that subject. He's got some ideas about what he calls projection and the shadow, and that might help you to understand what motivates human beings to go to war. I'd heard of Jung's name before that, but I hadn't paid very much attention, so I went out the next day to the bookstore and asked if they had anything by Jung, and lo and behold, the only thing they had there at the time was Memory, Dreams, Reflections. I bought it, and I've never turned back since. It changed my life. That if books can change your life, that one did mine. Certainly getting into Jung's ideas, and was totally fascinating to me. I forgot about territoriality, didn't forget about Vietnam, but got very interested in psychology through this political question, basically. What motivates human beings to engage in certain types of behavior? And of course, there are many explanations of human behavior, sociological explanations, economic explanations. There was Marxism at the time. There were lots of there are theological explanations. So this led me to consider depth psychological explanations. And that then brings us to our topic. Can depth psychology help us to understand human behavior in a special way? Can it get below the surface and help us really to get an insight into what makes people do what they do, and do it often quite unconsciously, instinctively? Does it help us to understand our own, first of all, our own motivations, but also the motivations of whole nations, whole masses of people doing things like going to war or engaging in other types of collective behaviors? Patterns of repetition. We know from personal psychology that people tend to repeat patterns. We see it in our own lives. We repeat the pattern of our childhood. We repeat the patterns of our parents' marriages and so on in our own. So we know about repetition and what Freud called the repetition compulsion. Does this also apply to masses of people, whole groups of people? Do they engage in repetitions? And I'll get to that in just a moment, what Jung talks about, the archetypal riverbeds of human behavior. So these were very interesting questions that I found some answers to as I began reading Jung and thinking about the world in depth psychological terms. Now, I do want to say that there are some problems with applying the insights and principles of individual psychology to group psychology. I mean, there are theoretical problems. Does everything that we can be sure of applies to individual psychology as we engage in it in our psychotherapy and reflect on our own lives? Does it really have an application when you get into large groups of people? Is there a problem leaping from inner personal psychological dynamics to large political dynamics? And I know Tom Singer will introduced the idea this afternoon, or has written about it in very interesting ways, using the concept of the transcendent function to speak about the creation of symbols and symbolic figures in collective and political movements. One could ask the question, is that valid? If you really look at it very carefully, what is the transcendent function as Jung meant it in his writings about it, which is this coming together of conscious and unconscious portions of the personality to form a third thing, creating symbols and so on. Does that really happen also in collectives? What is the collective unconscious that's coming together with collective consciousness in a collective transcendent function? It's an interesting question. Does it apply? And some people think it does, and others, Andrew Samuels has argued, maybe it's better not to use that concept. But I think these are all very interesting questions. Can you simply transpose from individual psychology into group psychology? That's a theoretical question. I'm not going to do too much with that. What I want to talk about now is Jung and politics. And I want to do a brief summary of some of the things that engaged Jung in his biography and his own personal life with regard to politics, and how he used psychological ideas to think about political movements. And this will be a kind of introduction to this theme that the rest of the day will be focusing on. Symbols and individuation in global politics and leadership. In the previous couple of sessions, we spent a lot of time on the Red Book, you'll recall, those of you who joined our video seminars for those sessions. And one of the very interesting features about the Red Book, and Sonu Shamdasani writes about this in his introduction, and it's in the Red Book itself very clearly, that when Jung began his midlife journey, 1912, 1913, he had some very disturbing visionary experiences, if you want to call them that, or kind of altered states of consciousness. He was riding on the train one day from Schaffhausen to Zurich. His in-laws lived in Schaffhausen, and he was coming back to Zurich from a visit. And while he was on the train, it's about a 40-minute ride or so, he had a vision of a map of Europe covered in blood, and the blood covered all of Europe right up to the Alps. And he was very disturbed by this, and it recurred a couple of times. Another visionary experience somewhat later, maybe a year later, he saw Europe frozen over, ice covering all of Europe. And these were, as a psychiatrist, he started wondering, if this is personal, is something terrible happening to me? Are these premonitions of a psychic collapse that's coming? Because he wasn't feeling too well at that time, just breaking up with Freud and going through a lot of rearrangement in his psychological attitudes and theories and so on. He was having a pretty hard time, so he wondered, am I about to fall apart? Am I about to collapse? Is this a personal thing that I'm experiencing? And then he says, when World War I broke out, 1914, August 1st, 1914, he felt a tremendous relief, because he suddenly realized that these inner experiences didn't have to do with him so much, primarily even maybe, but they had to do with what he was experiencing through his own psyche, in a personal way, with what's going on in the collective, what's going on in the wider world. And I think this was a big breakthrough in his thinking about the human psyche, that it isn't just an encapsulated individual personal thing, but it is connected. It's connected to the whole world. It's connected to the unus mundus, ultimately. It's connected to the cosmos, but it's also connected to politics. It's connected to what's going on in the society around us. So often in my practice, when people come to me with certain typical kinds of disturbances and anxieties and dreads and fears, and And I'm thinking, wow, this isn't just them. A lot of people are feeling this. You can read about it in the newspapers. You can see it on television. I feel it. I wake up in the middle of the night. I'm worried about the financial collapse. They're worried about it isn't just a personal thing. It can't be reduced to your childhood. And, you know, to your father saying, if you don't save your money and study hard, you're going to amount to nothing. It isn't just that kind of a personal issue. It's a much bigger issue. It applies to many people. So the idea of a collective unconscious, and what Tom Singer has done very important work on, a cultural unconscious and cultural complexes that are inside the person, or invade us, get into us from the culture around us and agitate us and cause all kinds of internal phenomena. I think this was a relief to Jung to realize that his crisis wasn't just a personal crisis, it was a historical crisis. Europe changed in 1914. It's never been the same since. It was a massive cultural shift. Everything was different afterwards. As in America after 9/11, everything was different. In the world after 9/11, everything is different. These things happen, they affect many people, and they get into our psyches. So this inner and outer, you know, the breakdown of a barrier between inner and outer was a very important realization on Jung's part. And that inner phenomena can be premonitory, can be premonitions of what's going to happen outside, and what happens outside might be a premonition of what can happen inside because it gets into us. We're a part of things. No man's an island. This was realized by John Donne several hundred years ago, and Jung rediscovered it in his own experience. And I think that's a way to link personal psychology and collective archetypal or cultural psychology, that we are not isolated from it, that we are infected by it, we are affected by it, and we enact it in various ways. And Jung would write about this. I'll tell you a little bit in just a moment, some of the things that he said on that subject in the 1930s. So that's in the Red Book. We discover this breakthrough of Jung's between individual psychology and collective psychology, and then toward the end of the First World War, he started writing and talking about what he called the blonde beast. The blonde beast is stirring in the Germanic psyche, and he based this on, he said, dreams and clinical material that he gathered from some of his patients. And he started getting the feeling, the deep feeling, that this blonde beast, or there was an inner barbarian that was becoming very restless and agitated under the surface of the European psyche, particularly the German psyche. And he could see this in dreams. And this augured for him something further, that the First World War wasn't the end. Now, of course, many people would have thought that on the basis of what happened at the end of the First World War and the kind of agreements that were made and the crises that were created through the redistribution of lands and breaking up of all kinds of old nations, states, and so on. It was a very chaotic time. Weimar Germany was a chaos, and so on and so forth. But Jung saw it on an inner level also, that there is something under the surface that he called the blonde beast, or the inner barbarian, that it has to be reckoned with, a dark shadow aspect that's stirring down there somewhere. And it isn't just an individual shadow, it's a collective shadow. Okay, so this is would be, Tom Singer would call it collective, or a cultural complex, I guess. But it's more than just an individual thing. And he started getting a very uneasy feeling about what might be transpiring in the future. And I want to say this about Jung because often he's taken to be sort of isolated from the world, you know, an introvert, introspective, sitting out at his tower in Bollingen, dreaming his dreams and creating the Red Book and doing his individual work and his inner work, all of which he did. There's a record of all that, and it's clear. But on the other hand, he was very sensitive to what was going on in the world around him as well. And he comments on it in many places. He wrote a lot of essays that have to do with the times, what's happening in the times, and he wrote them for various kinds of popular journals and magazines. These were not professional psychiatric articles or psychoanalytic articles. These were really comments on what's going on in the world today, what's going on around us. Now, Jung's life takes an important turn toward the end of the 1920s, and it's very hard to pin down exactly what happened there, but there are a couple of important things that he mentions in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and some other places that I want to just mention, and then I want to say that his life really became much more dedicated to the collective and the outer world and the political world after about 1928, 1929 than it had been since he entered his midlife transformation process about 1913. That period, he calls the confrontation with the unconscious, lasted till almost 1930. That's when he made the Red Book. It's not that he wasn't doing other things. He was traveling and lecturing. He went to Africa in the 1920s, and he traveled to a number of places, North America and England many times. But I think he was really more engaged in his own internal process. Around 1927, 1928, he met Richard Wilhelm. And he says in the obituary notice that, or the obituary memorial article that he wrote about Richard Wilhelm, who died in 1930 at a rather young age from a disease he caught in China. He was a missionary to China for about 20 years. He says that Richard Wilhelm was the most important influence on his life, more than Freud, he says. So Sonu Shamdasani is trying to get us from being too Freudocentric with Jung's life. I think Jung might agree. Freud was an influence, but there were other influences too. And he says Richard Wilhelm was such a big influence. And I've scratched my head many times, how was Richard Wilhelm such a big influence on his life? Well, there were a couple of things. One was that Richard Wilhelm sent him a picture and asked him to write a commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower, an ancient Chinese alchemy text. And when he got the picture, a mandala picture, he recognized a painting of his that he'd been working on in the Red Book as strikingly similar to this Chinese painting. And he felt some sort of resonance with the Chinese. He had for a long time anyway. I mean, he was very interested in the I Ching, which Richard Wilhelm had translated, and he'd read in an earlier translation by another, not as good as Wilhelm's translation, but he was interested in Taoist philosophy, yin and yang, all of that, balance, harmonization of the opposites. But this intervention from Richard Wilhelm really hit him at a certain moment that he would call synchronistic later. And this picture of the mandala from the Secret of the Golden Flower and his painting and the similarities struck him as so unusual and so odd. And then he read the text and he wrote this wonderful commentary. It's one of the great things he wrote, in which he starts seeing the parallels between what's going on in himself and some of his patients and what the Chinese alchemy meditators were up to in ancient times, and he makes all kinds of connections between them. And just about exactly at this time, he suddenly just stops writing in the Red Book. I mean, he stops in mid-sentence. Nobody can quite figure out why did he stop. One of my theories was he couldn't figure out how to finish it. Another is that, well, he got bored with it. I sometimes think, well, he just outgrew it. What he says is that this text captured his interest in alchemy. And he put everything else aside and started buying alchemy books and getting involved in his alchemy studies, which he carried on then into the next decades, mostly European alchemy, not Chinese alchemy in particular, but medieval alchemy and ancient European alchemy all the way back to the Egyptian Zosimos and those kinds of authors. And he then lost interest, in a sense, in what he had been doing, and the Red Book was finished to his satisfaction, sort of like a snake sheds its skin and leaves that behind, and he goes on to something else. And so alchemy became like the backbone of his investigations and his studies for the rest of his life, culminating in his great late book, Mysterium Conjunctionis. So that's one thing. Jung changed because of that. He shifted his interest to alchemy, and he joined a psychotherapy association called the General Medical Association for Psychotherapists. And this was an organization made up largely of German-speaking. There were Swiss, Germans, and others, but the largest group were the Germans. And the mission of this organization, which he joined in 1928 or 1929, just at about the same time as he met Richard Wilhelm, who also incidentally came to Zurich and lectured at the Psychological Club a couple of times in 1928. He, as a well-known psychiatrist, made quite a big splash in that organization. The mission of that organization was to keep psychotherapy free from psychiatry. And and because Jung feared that psychiatry would take the depth psychological aspects away from psychotherapy, and already psychiatry has forever been basically biologically based, didn't have all the tools it has today, but still the sanitariums and so on were filled with chronic patients, and they had their treatment modalities, and nobody really listened to the patients. Jung was not at all happy with psychiatry when he practiced it at the Berg-Holzli Clinic. That's why he left, and he left psychiatry at a pretty early age in order to involve himself in depth psychology and his own inner work and working with patients in a different way. And this group of psychotherapists, largely German but international, was very involved in trying to make psychotherapy a profession unto itself, apart from psychiatry. And Jung wanted to support that. And the president at that time was a man named Kretschmer. He was a well-known German psychiatrist. And it wasn't a terribly large group, but it was an increasingly important group. And so he started becoming political. And increasingly, during the 30s, he was drawn into politics, professional politics, by his membership in this organization. And it's very controversial what happened in the 1930s, because in 1933, when Hitler took control of Germany in January, the psychiatrist Kretschmer resigned as president of this organization, and the Germans felt that they needed a president who was international and who was a figure, a major figure, a major international figure, and they asked Jung to become the president. Jung didn't want to become the president. He didn't like that much bureaucratic business. He wasn't that interested in it, but he accepted finally with the understanding that he would be the president from Switzerland, that the headquarters of the organization and its journal would move to Switzerland, and his right-hand man, C.A. Meyer, would be the editor of the journal, and with him, and that they would try to make this an international organization and keep two things: one, out of the hands of psychiatry, and secondly, to keep psychotherapy alive in Germany. Those were his two missions, political missions, with regard to that organization. First thing he did was to make it international, to give it a different name and call it an international organization. Secondly, he tried to get other groups, other national groups, to become members of that organization so the Germans wouldn't dominate it so much, although they were always the biggest single group in that organization. And so he became very involved in all these politics. Every year he had to give an address to this organization. They had their congresses in different places. I think one of the last ones, 1938, was in Oxford, England. He edited the journal. And he kept up a correspondence with his various colleagues in that organization. So the way I read his participation in that, these were his most political years, from 1930 to 1940, when the Second World War broke out, 1939, 1940, and that organization basically collapsed. He tried to be involved in this world not in an ivory tower on top of a mountain, or sitting in a cave meditating, or retreating to Bollingen to the mountains, to the safety of neutral Switzerland. He wanted to stay engaged in the world. And I think he did that because he felt he owed the collective a debt. He wrote a paper in 1916 or 1917 that was delivered to the Psychological Club, an early paper in which he says, the person who individuates and withdraws from the world into this inner process has to pay it back sometime, owes a debt to the world for what he takes from the world. So the extent to which you withdraw your libido from the world to introvert, do your inner work, go away, sit in your isolation for a period of time, to that same degree, you're going to have to give libido back to the world. You owe it. If you don't do it, you're going to be guilty. You're going to have a kind of existential guilt on your hands. And I think that was Jung's personal reason for doing this. He felt that the world was in a crisis. He had to do something, and this was offered to him, and this is what he could do, and this is what he did. Now, in the middle of that period, 1936, he wrote what has come to be quite a famous essay called Wotan. And it was published in a small Swiss journal that he was a consultant for. There were 5 or 6 Swiss who managed this journal, and this is what it looked like. This is the journal. It's called Neue Schweizer Rundschau, 1936, March 1936. There you see Wotan, C.G. Jung. This is the Wotan essay. In the same essay, there's a poem by by Robert de Harcourt, who was an editor of the journal. There's an essay, a biographical essay on Cosima Wagner, Richard Wagner's wife. There are book reviews. It's basically a literary magazine, a small literary magazine called the Neue Schweizer Rundschau, with a very limited circulation in Switzerland. And in this, it's really a political essay. It's a political analysis of what's going on in Germany in the 1930s. And I don't have time to go into it in detail. It's a fascinating article. I just will give you a couple of the points that Jung makes in there, because I think they have to do with a depth psychological, a Jungian approach to the collective and to politics and to leadership. And in this essay, he thinks that he can identify an archetypal pattern that is beneath the surface of the phenomena of what's going on in this crazy place, Germany of the 1930s. And basically, he takes the view that this is a society or a collective that is possessed. They've lost their consciousness, and they've entered into a regression. And he uses the word Ergriffenheit, which means possession, and Ergreifer, which is the possessor. He says if somebody is ergriffen, if they're possessed, they're possessed by something, by a possessor. So there is this concept of a collective, a mass movement being possessed by an archetypal energy, an archetypal pattern, force, power. And the leader, the so-called leader of that, and he uses the word leader with a tongue-in-cheek, is possessed by the same power, by the same force, and is like the spokesman for that force. And he says that force is the ancient Germanic god Wotan. And he makes quite an extensive argument for why it's Wotan and not Dionysus, and why it's not some other god. He says Wotan is embedded in the national psyche. In nations that have a coherence, and we have to think about a nation like Germany, where everybody is German. Okay, this is not an international society at that time. Everybody's German, like in Japan. Everybody's Japanese. Less than 1% of the people who live in Japan, even today, aren't Japanese, are not. America is such a different place. Switzerland's a very different place. 30% of the people who live in Switzerland are not Swiss. But when you get countries where you've got this homogeneous population, they all belong to that tribe. And that tribe has a root in history, a pre-Christian root. And those pre-Christian roots have disappeared in the meantime because Christianity took over. The new God that took over, Christ and Christendom, is an international God. It's not a local God. It's not a national God. Christ is for the world. Christ is, from the New Testament times onward, was not a national God. Didn't belong to anybody, any particular people. That was Paul's message to the Gentiles. Christ is for everybody. Christ is an international God, a global God. Wotan is a very specific tribal national God that belongs to this people, the Germans. Okay, die Deutschen. Deutsche Nation, and has its roots and has been passed on subterraneanly under the surface of this Christian facade, so to speak. And now that Christendom has weakened at the end of its second millennium, has weakened to the extent it's lost its grip on the collective, so that it cannot tell the Germans what to do anymore. It can't say it's wrong to go to war against the French. The French are also Christians. It's wrong to go into Poland. Poland's are also Catholics. You can't fight against your brothers. Christendom is helpless. The Pope's words mean nothing. The Christian churches can do nothing. This is a movement of the nation from the bottom. And what has happened, he says, is that the libido has regressed for various reasons. Call it maybe the First World War, the economic crisis, all kinds of collective reasons. The libido has regressed to an old riverbed. And he says these archetypal patterns are like old riverbeds. For a long time, no water runs in them, but the bed is still there. And then when something dams up the water in another place, the water finds the old riverbed and comes rushing down, and comes down with such a force. If you've ever seen the floodwaters coming down in a dry country like Arizona or someplace, that they sweep away everything in front of them. They rush with a madness and a wildness. And those are the images that Jung uses to describe this Wotanic energy, Wotan's energy in Germany. He says here in Switzerland, we look at it with a kind of smile on our faces. We hear a little bit and we look the other way. We don't want to be bothered by it, but we see it in the south in Italy. We see something going on there. We see it in the north in Germany. And we're frightened of it, but we don't want to admit it. But up there, it's wild. It's like a wild stream finding an old riverbed, sweeping everything in front of it. And this is the state of possession. And their so-called leader, Der Führer, is as helpless as anybody else to control this. He just speaks for it. He gets in front of it. It's going to destroy him. It's going to destroy them. This is a madness. This is a wild, manic, crazed situation. These people are in a state of possession. That's what he says in the Wotan paper. So there's this idea that collectively the masses can regress to an old pattern, an old regressive, very primitive, very emotional. He says Wotan is emotion and intuition. It has nothing to do with thinking. There's no reflection there. There's no thinking function. It's the old brain run amok. And it's totally unconnected to higher. Where are the German philosophers? Where is their culture? It's swept away. Nobody is standing in the way of this thing, and he stands in awe of it. It's an incredible sight to behold. He doesn't have any prescriptions for it. He just says it won't last forever. It will pass, and we'll see what the future holds. I mean, what's going to come out of this, nobody knows, but it's headed for destruction. This was 1936, and of course, things got really bad after that, and the worst in the 40s. And so it was a premonition, an intuition, a strong, and an archetypal analysis of a collective situation. That's what I want to say, that there's a way in which you can look at a collective, especially when it's in a high state of agitation, and it's constellated and galvanized, and you can perhaps see below the surface some old archetypal riverbeds filling up and channeling this energy. What the riverbeds do is channel. They channel the energy that is released by the collective. And so Jung was always very suspicious, isn't quite the right word, but afraid, if anything, of mass-mindedness and mass movements. He knew, you get people in a state of panic or in a state of agitation, they are not thinking. You see this in soccer games, soccer stadiums. You see it with rock and roll fans when suddenly there's an outburst and they all try to cram through a small doorway and people are killed, or people are not thinking in their chaotic agitation and in emotional state. Something else is going on. The old brain is taken over, and it's fight or flight, and very primitive reactions like that. Before I stop and we get a few questions and I turn it over to Bernard, I want to say one more thing, and that's about leadership. From Richard Wilhelm, Jung got the idea of what is a good leader, the ideal of leadership. If you want a good leader, Barack Obama, if you want to become a good leader, here's what you would do by the prescription of C.G. Jung, okay? Jung got the story from Richard Wilhelm of the Rainmaker. This is an old Chinese story. Actually, Richard Wilhelm says he witnessed this and was a part of it. There was a town, he lived in Qingdao, China. Qingdao was a German enclave in China, and he said one year, a couple of years, there was a terrible drought. They had no water, no snow, nothing. And the people were getting very upset and didn't know what to do. Finally, they decided to call the Rainmaker, a distant figure who was supposed to be able to create rain, a shaman. So they called him, and Jung was very impressed by this story. He actually said to Barbara Hanna, whenever you lecture, Barbara Hanna, tell this story of the Rainmaker, because this is the ideal of leadership. The Rainmaker came to this town, and he talked to a few people, and he questioned them, what's going on here, what's happening. And then he said, what you need to do is build me a little hut outside the town. I'm going to go into that hut for a few days and we'll see what happens. So he did that and went into that hut, and 3 days later it started actually to snow. And then it rained, and they were jubilant and they couldn't believe it, and he came out of his hut. And Wilhelm said he went up to him and he asked him, well, what did you do? How did this happen? How did you make rain? And Rainmaker, shaman, said, well, I came to this town. I saw things were not in order. People were out of order. They were agitated. They were not centered. And so I thought I would just bring myself to order. I would sit in that hut and I would meditate and I would find order in myself. And if I find order in myself, the cosmos will be well. And if it's supposed to rain, it will rain. Whatever is meant will be. Now, the Rainmaker is, I think, Jung's ideal of leadership. He says in a 1933 radio interview in Berlin, this is 6 months after Hitler has taken power, a guy named Weizsäcker is interviewing him, and Weizsäcker is trying to get Jung to say that sometimes the masses, the people, know more than the individual. And this was Nazi ideology, that the collective and the Führer knows what's best for everybody. The individual counts for nothing. In fact, Hitler said at one point, this is quoted in an essay, famously, shortly after he took power, Hitler said, if I can find it. In March 1933, he took power in January. In March 1933, Hitler said, treason to the country and people will be persecuted from now on with barbarian severity. And he sure meant it. Treason to the country and people, das Volk, okay? So any individual who raises any questions, treason, will be persecuted from now on with barbarian severity. And those were his brown shirts, and people who went out, if anybody raised a question or a protest, kill them. That's barbarian severity. Okay, now in in, I think it was July or August of 1933, Jung was interviewed on Radio Berlin by this guy Weizsäcker. And he says this famous line, I think it's so memorable. He says, I'll say it in German and then I'll give you the context. Wenn aber sich selbst nicht kennt, wie will andere führen? If he does not know himself, how can he lead others? Okay? Here's what he says to Weizsäcker. The self-development of the individual is especially necessary in our time. Weizsäcker was trying to get him to say, das Volk knows best. The people know best. The collective knows best. Jung contradicts him flatly, and he says, the self-development of the individual is especially necessary in our time. When the individual is unconscious of himself, the collective movement, too, lacks a clear sense of purpose. Only the self-development of the individual, which I consider to be the supreme goal of all psychological endeavor, saying this right in the teeth of Nazi ideology, can produce consciously responsible spokesmen and leaders of the collective movement. Then he says, as Hitler said recently, he's sitting there, Hitler's down the street, the leader must be able to be alone and must have the courage to go his own way. That's a quote from Hitler. Now Jung. But if he doesn't know himself, how is he to lead others? This is a challenge. This is why the true leader is always one who has the courage to be himself and can look not only others in the eye, but above all himself. Now, I think what he has in mind here is a shamanic leader, not Hitler, who was a mad leader. And incidentally, the Germans gave leadership a bad word, and leader, der Führer, that's the German word for leader, gave that word a bad name. But we talk a lot about leadership in our time, and it's very important discussion in business and in politics. What is a good leader and what is a good enough leader? Andrew Samuel has done a lot of work on what is a good enough leader. Jung's idea of a leader is somebody who knows himself, somebody who is introverted enough to have contacted the self, somebody who has some kind of cosmic awareness, somebody who's in touch with a bigger picture and is not narcissistically sealed off. That's what a leader should do and should be. So I guess our advice to Barack Obama would be, when in doubt, get yourself a good Jungian analyst or introvert and find your center, because it's only out of that kind of spiritual center that's balanced and that has a perspective on the times that one can lead people somewhere, that they don't know where they need to go or where they want to go. I mean, to speak for something higher, something larger, something broader, needs a connection to one's own center. We talk about the ego-self axis. We'd say a good leader is somebody who has a developed ego-self axis, has contact with the self, and can access that on a regular basis. Now, I think maybe instead of taking time now, because we're running a little late, for questions, I'd like to introduce Bernard and let him do his piece, and then we'll take, and in the third hour there'll be lots of time for questions to both of us, and I don't want to cut Bernard short, so I know he's very well prepared. And Steve has introduced him already. I would just like to say a couple of words about Bernard. He's a very good colleague and friend of mine here at ISAP in Zurich. He's a founding member of ISAP. He graduated from the Jung Institute just about the same time I did, in 1973, 74. He was trained as a Protestant theologian, but he tells me he was never ordained. He did work within a church context for some years. He was in analysis for quite a long time with von Franz, and so has a very strong classical Jungian background, but really as his own person has done a lot of work in the last several years in the dialogue between West and Islam, has traveled widely in the Middle East, and has studied a lot of those texts in the Quran will talk to us about politics and global politics and 9/11 a bit. And Bernard, do you want to come and sit here?
Thank you, Murray. Hello. It's very strange to talk to people who are in the same time present and absent. It's a psychic new experience. Yes, my attempt will be, of course, in an English which is not as fluent as the one of Murray's, to try to have a glimpse at what could be our present collective psychic constellation. And this in the West. I mean, just put it maybe frame within our Western context, America, Europe, and the other developed, so-called developed countries, which, as we know, tend to give their values more and more to the rest of the world. In order to try to understand that, what's happening, I will give you a short summary of the way the reality was symbolized in our Western civilization through the collective symbols. And we will see that through those collective symbols, we will make, of course, a very quick trip through the history of the Western civilization, that through the collective symbols which each of those civilizations had, we can see how reality was apprehended, the way the people of those various periods related to reality. And this will lead us to the present situation, to the situation in which we, on the collective level, we relate to reality. And we will see that this relation is a schizoid one. Schizoid is, I would say, is even a mild form, is a split, is a way of relating in a split way, with many splits in the way of relating to reality. And I will shortly show you how those splits have occurred. If we start very quickly, and of course you will have a much more profound perception of that with the next seminar with Andreas Schweitzer. With Old Egypt, we can say in a nutshell that there was a wholeness in the way of perceiving reality. The rational mind and the symbolic perception of reality and the religious perception of reality were not split one from another. There were, of course, different emphases, but I cannot go into details now in illustrations, but the old Egyptian, all the specialists would agree on that, had to a certain extent the perception of a unus mundus, where all the parts are related, and his way to relate to them was also with one kind of perception. If we look later, after that, we have the old Greeks, and there already we start to have a first important split between, in this case, between interiority and exteriority. This can be of experiencing reality, my inner life and my way of looking at the outside world. This can be very well described in an example. On the one hand, there was the huge statue of Athena in the temple of Athens. Huge, extraverted statue made of pure gold and probably ivory and so forth, to celebrate the victory of the Greeks over the Persians. And on the other hand, we had the daimon, the inner spirit, the inner soul figure inside Socrates, telling him the truth about life. So here we see a very clear illustration of an outer expression of symbolic life, the big statue of Athena, and of inner life, symbolized by this demon, by this daimon, which has nothing to do with our demons being aspects of the devil. With the Hellenism, another split occurs, which of course starts to appear in classical Greece, but then takes a serious momentum with Hellenism. And this is the split between matter and spirit. So we have not only now inner world and outer world, but we have also material realities and spiritual realities starting to be experienced as being very different, if not even opposed. In Plotinus, for instance, we see that there is a hierarchy between the so-called spiritual world and the material world, the spiritual being, of course, superior to the material one. With the Romans, we have another split in the way of perceiving reality. We have the split between what is useful and what is not useful. The Romans started really to be, of course, you know, you can imagine all this is a big summary, very brutal summary. The Romans, they started to have a functional society, where what is functioning is, to a certain extent, the most important element in the whole civilization. As you know, the Romans developed a road system which allowed, for instance, a letter at this time to go from Turkey to Spain faster than today. If it goes by land road. They developed an extensive and very good administration up to the very last corners of the empire. I don't have to go into the details. And the symbolic life, to a certain extent, started to become privatized. As you know, first the Roman religion was the one of ancestors, and then afterwards all the gods from the Mediterranean basin came into the Roman into Rome, and so each one had his private cult, his private chapel, his private altar somewhere, his group to which he belonged. So we have here the split between interiority and exteriority, which appeared already with the Greeks, is now overdetermined, is emphasized by the difference between what is useful and what is not useful. We have the beginning of this very modern idea that ultimately what counts is what is useful, and the rest is private matter, what is practically useful. Then we have another split occurring with the Hebrews and then with the church. With the Hebrews, we have the mythology of the chosen people by God. So we have two kinds of humanities to a certain extent. Even if, of course, there are texts which say quite clearly that all human beings are creatures of God, but there is this representation that there is a special population which is particularly chosen by God through the alliance of the Old Testament. With a particular truth, of course, because when you say chosen by God, this means also that you have more truths in your possession, so to speak, than the ones who are not chosen. So we have, going along with this split between chosen and not chosen, we have the very, very strong emphasis upon what is true and what is false. A split between truth and error, which then later, as you know, in the church goes into correct faith and heresy, leading to burning the heretics. With the church, this notion of being chosen and not chosen extends to the whole church, but those who are outside the church, there still remain to a certain extent a population which is not as too close to God as the ones who are inside the church. Through the baptism and so forth, we have this passage possibility to go inside those who are chosen. With Christianity, we have, of course, a symbol, a collective symbol, which again will be very integrating, and this is the Mass. Jung writes a very, very beautiful essay on the symbolism of the Mass, showing that, this is in the collective works about psychology and religion, showing how the Mass is an integrating symbol of various opposites, and also of the various opposites of the splits, in fact, I just indicated, of interiority, exteriority, of matter and spirit, of being chosen and not chosen to a certain extent. All those opposites are integrated to a certain extent in the experience of the Mass. But the previous splits between matter and spirit, between chosenness and not chosenness, and so forth, interiority and exteriority, of course, have not disappeared. And that's why, with the Christian main symbolism, the Mass, it was not enough to produce again an integration of the perception of reality. And that's why, as you know, in a compensating way, there a whole lot of esoteric perceptions of reality had to be symbolized in alchemy, in astrology, and one hoped to perceive more wholeness in the perception of reality through those disciplines than through the classical theology. Now, when we will come very quickly now to our modernity. With Renaissance, the Renaissance, we have all the splits I already indicated, and that you have a new one, which appears in a very, very strong way, and this is which was of course already in Nietzsche, in the privatization of religion to a certain extent in the imperial Rome, and this is the split between individual and collective. In the Renaissance time, the value of the individual becomes paramount. It's really then that when you look at the painters, you see that then, even if they represent religious scenes, what is interesting them is to paint particular citizens of the city they were living in. So the individual got a paramount value. And the symbols, and at the same time, the rationality, which was, of course, already very developed in the Middle Ages, became the main faculty of perception reality. There is a symptom for that, which is very interesting, which is appearing in the Renaissance, and that the symbols start to be transformed into allegories. As you know, a symbol is an image or a statue or something which is representative of an unknown reality, while an allegory is an image to say, with the help of an image, something which words can say as well. If you take one of the older Greek gods, like for instance Aphrodite, in the Renaissance she is not a goddess anymore, but she is a sign for love. Mars is a sign for war, and so forth and so forth. Jupiter is a sign for political power, but there is no more symbolic relating to them, which implies always a mystery in the image. In the Protestant Reformation, you probably one can see that there is a straight consequence of what I said in the Protestant Reformation. If images become allegories, you don't need images anymore. You can, they would rather be disturbing. So one can get rid of them, and the Mars becomes allegory. The Mars is not a symbol anymore where something mysterious happens through the bread and the wine being transformed mystically at the moment through the consecration words of the priest, but it becomes an allegory of an image of the death of Christ, of his crucifixion, and of the community partaking the bread and the wine. With the Enlightenment, to go now very quickly in order to come to our present time, we see that all this rationality is taken the lead, and what is really symbolical in the sense of helping to connect to the soul in a wider sense tends to disappear from the collective. At the time of the Enlightenment, the big buildings were the castles by the kings and queens, were the first universities. They were, by the way, started already in the Middle Ages, but were the first museums, were all the first collections, all things to celebrate knowledge, rational knowledge, and rational identification of reality. There is in Einsiedeln, and the last churches built by the whole collective, they are of Baroque and Rococo style. And there we see something very interesting. For instance, in Einsiedeln, where I live close by, is a huge old monastery built in the Rococo times, in the end of the 17th, in the middle of the 17th century, 18th century, and it has frescoes on the ceiling, and those frescoes depict, for instance, the Assumption of the Holy Virgin, or for instance the resurrection of Christ, rising out of his tomb, and they are painted in an absolutely realistic style, like photographs, as if you had taken somebody had been there and had taken the photographs of those events. Now, when something like this happens, when something which is of some symbolical nature starts to be depicted in a naturalistic way, as it is the case there in Einsiedel, it indicates always the end of the symbol. Because this means that, of the symbolic perception, that it means that you have to press the symbolic perception of it, the symbolic relatedness to it, into something you can touch, you can see in a very concrete way, like your neighbor beside you. And there, this means that in fact the symbolic feeling has already disappeared. Now, if we take then afterwards the 19th century, we have of course all the collective symbolic investments. They were the big schools, they were the big universities, they were the railroads started then, the first roads, but especially the railroads, the factories, the organization of economic life, to say it short. Of course, the military. I will come to that. Has took also a very great importance. And there was the Romantic period in the 19th century, and there we have some flashback, I would say, in the Romantic period. We have Goethe, we have Schelling, we have a lot of people who really experienced personally symbolic life. Goethe, of course, is well known for that, and his Faust and all this. We have the Romantics in general, the great musicians. But what is striking is that they are not anymore supported by the whole collective. There are segments of the population which are fans of those musicians, of those artists, of those writers. There is still a very important symbolic life existing, especially in the Romantic period, but it's not the whole of society which is investing into it anymore. The society is investing in the railroads, in the factories, in the whole apparatus of production, which will reach its peak, of course, in the 20th century. And so there is a symbolic life starts more and more, well, what we saw already begin with the Greeks, retreat into the private sector. There are still churches being built, but they are built not anymore by the collective, they are built by individual parishes or by associations of Christians. The artistic life, of course, is very important, painters and all this, but they are all matter in a certain way of private sensibilities, of various private personal sensibilities. Now we come to the 20th century. Murray just made all this goes on, of course, with even more momentum in the 20th century. Murray made a quick allusion to what happened with the big ideologies of the 20th centuries, and I would say, yes, and also as Jung said it in his Wotan, there is a re-emergence of symbolic life first in collective symbolic life, first in the nationalisms, which led to the territory, which led to the First World War, and then afterwards nationalism, and combined with a mystique of blood and soil and of race in fascism and National Socialism. And then there is a resurgence of the community, the togetherness in communism. But you see it yourself, all those three forms of resurgence of collective symbolic life are perverted forms, are symptoms. Nationalism connects to a certain extent rightly to the territory, but in such a perverted forms that that millions of people had to die in the First World War. National Socialism connects to a certain extent with symbolic life linked with the earth and with nature. That makes us sometimes very uneasy if one reads certain Nazi texts. But it's completely perverted. It's violent. It's a possession, as just Murray indicated through the text of Wotan. It is something absolutely destructive. And communism the same. It is a resurgence of symbolic life in the deep sense of relatedness with other human beings, taking care of their needs and so forth. But also it comes in a possessed form, and it's of course that was used by individuals for their own advantage, so that it was also not a real re-emergence of collective symbolic life, and because they were collective symbolic lives wanting to break through repression, and these repressive levels. They have, of course, as I just tried to show, installed themselves in the previous centuries and through all the history, in fact, gradually of our Western civilization. So symbolic life, and this is also part of the 20th century, retreats decisively into the life of the individual. And so we have, which is quite obvious then, the starting of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, Freud and then Jung, are an attempt, sometimes a successful attempt, to experience symbolic life on the individual level. And there is, of course, a connection with the fascination for psychoanalysis in the 20th century, because with a symbolic life having more or less disappeared from the collective, or only having appeared in perverted forms, like in the ideologies I just indicated, the whole life of the psyche, in its symbolism, so to speak, has to be carried by the individual. And this, of course, to a certain extent also was, and is still, much too heavy for many individuals. If we have a family background, which was difficult, it is too heavy for an individual to carry the intensity of a soul life. And so we have in the 20th century and also now more and more psychological disturbances which one sees coming from the pressure of this symbolic life, which cannot be experienced anymore through participation in a collective symbol. You probably understand what I try to say is that the lack of possibility to participate in a collective symbol gives a tremendous inner pressure to the individual who is alone with the whole symbolic possibilities the psyche has in herself. And the Red Book by Jung is also such an example where an individual, a single person, had to carry and to express I don't know how many symbols of humanity. Now, if we come, I spoke now of all those various splits in the perception of, in the way of perceiving reality, individual, collective, inner, outer, rational, irrational, all those different splits. When you have a perception and you tear it of a certain wholeness, like in the old Egyptian, and you tear it apart through those various splits, the image which comes to me is really like a cloth. If you pull on all sides of that cloth, what is happening? You tear it apart, and a hole will appear in this tissue, a real hole, a void. And my hypothesis is that this is in fact what's happening now on the collective level. We are now in a collective symbolic situation, so to speak, of nothingness, of void. Of course, we have our whole apparatus of production. We have our all the collectivity take care of all what's necessary for the good functioning of the society, as good as possible functioning of society. But we have no there is no more symbolic hope on the level of the whole society. Hope and investment possible on the level of the whole society. I speak, of course, here as an European. Maybe in the States it's still a bit different. Of course, this is a remark I should have made before. All the various states of this perception of collective symbolism, they still coexist. Of course, we still have somewhere in some forest in Brazil, we might find a tribe which is still in the Stone Age and has still a perception of collective symbolism, which was the one of the Stone Age. But what I am interested in is what's the vanguard of the evolution, and the vanguard of the evolution is this void, is that there's no more ideologies. Religions lose their momentum. I speak of the West. Lose their momentum or get privatized to the utmost. And we have a certain number of signs which indicate that it is indeed the case that the collective present to today's symbolic situation is one of void and of nothingness. If you look, for instance, at the latest production of Hollywood, for instance, you have a lot of apocalyptic movies. To 2012, or a lot of earthquake and flooding and all kinds of movies showing a destruction, tornado, and I mean, I did not make the list, but they are Hollywood produces a lot of them. And not only Hollywood, also in Europe they're produced. If we look at the at some dreams of people, one can see this nothingness very well formulated. For instance, a colleague of mine, Ingrid Riedel, had a patient who told her the following dream. She saw a big building, and by the way, it's interesting, this dream was dreamt a couple of years before 9/11. She saw a huge modern building made of steel and glass, and in the basement of that building there was a turtle, a porpoise turtle with a nice big shell. Suddenly, a pipe in this building, this building was a little bit like Beaubourg in Paris, had a lot of pipes, visible pipes. A pipe of this building was starting to leak, and an acid started to fall on the shell of this turtle. At the beginning she does not feel anything, but then suddenly she feels something, and she starts to shake because she has pain under this acid, and produces an earthquake, and the building collapses on top of her. And after a while the rubble starts to move again, and the turtle comes out of this rubble. Her shell is again intact, has no hole in it anymore, and she moves out of the picture, going towards the right side, which is usually, symbolically speaking, the future. This dream impressed very much my colleague and also the patient, and I think it's really a dream, not just a dream with a personal value. Of course, one probably it had also a meaning for the dreamer, but it's an example of many dreams which we see lately in our practices, which have of this type with this type of motive, showing this nothingness of purpose as it was symbolized so far by the modern building. This is collapsing. Now, of course, I could give you other examples of this in the cartoons, in theater plays, in literature. I don't have to go. You probably know this as well as myself. This is now not the point to expand on that. Maybe we can discuss more examples after that. There are reactions to that. There are two reactions, and the one is compensations, we would say in our language. Youth is emphasized. Everybody has to be young, healthy, beautiful. And the young people also themselves, as long as they are young, they do not feel so much this nothingness, because their love life, their immediate professional purposes fill them up, and the pressure which they have coming from the requirements of the universities, this does not leave them much time and much inner space to feel the nothingness. There are of course quite a lot to do so, and then they would very easily fall into an inner hole, into a real hole. There is on that level of the modern youth situation, I would say there is one word which describes very well what's going on, and this is the word surfing. You surf on the sea waves, you surf on the snow, you surf on the internet, you surf on the street with a surfboard. Surfing allows to go quickly, to feel that you're alive, and to go quickly over the things, because otherwise you would feel something, a great void. You would feel a great void, and something maybe even which might produce an anguish. So big compensation on youth, and another one is of course the consumer society, which everybody can imagine that if it's correct what I just said, if now the collective situation is the one of a void, this produces anxiety, and one of the best way of fighting anxiety is to eat. To eat or to consume. I mean, it does not necessarily have to be literal eating, but any psychoanalyst knows that to consume in whatever form things is an antidote to anxiety. Now, this nothingness, resulting, in my understanding, from a whole process of successive splits in the way of apprehending reality, has now synchronistic situations which appear not only in the Western world, synchronistically, in the sense of, in my understanding, this is very meaningful, that what's happening in the rest of the world, and also what we are confronted with, we as Western societies. And those two synchronistic realities, which I would just, before finishing, speak about, is the one, the Islamic world, which is in a very in a great tension and confrontation with our world. I will come back to that. And the other one is the nature, is the objective limits which nature sets now to our development, to our civilization, so to speak. First, one or two words about Islam. As you know, in Islam, this void I speak about, that's some strange synchronicity, is very much in the center of their faith. If you take the way they speak now, of course, you must. If I speak about Islam, I think about real Muslims, not about extremists. We will maybe come back to that in our discussion, but not extremists who, in fact, in my understanding, have not understood Islam. But in Islam, as it is lived by the peaceful, normal Muslim populations, as I personally know them through my travels in Morocco, in Syria, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Turkey. I have friends all over those countries. For them, the Allah is not very far away from this totally unknown, not even which cannot even be qualified by the word reality, which to a certain extent could be somewhere also perceptible in this nothingness I just spoke till now about. Of course, they have a more precise representation. There is a theology in Islam, but this theology is very apophatic, in a sense. That's a technical word to say. Ultimately, the less one speaks about, the better. Of course, the Quran is a book. Is full of words. There's a lot of words, speaking, kalam, in the Quran. But if you read the Quran, it's very interesting to see that it always points at an unknown. It points at Allah, of course, but it does never give a shape or any kind, even a mythological shape to Allah. In Christianity, we have the Holy Ghost, a dove. We have in the Trinity, we have Jesus Christ, God who has become man. In the Islamic representation of God or perception of God, it's it's something absolutely unthinkable. God is ultimately unthinkable. And there are theologians who say that even if I say there is a God, I say too much. Again, of course, we must be careful. This is not the way it's maybe necessarily perceived by the man of the street, but in his face, in his way of putting God in the center of his life, it is this mystery. It is this mystery. And so it is, I would say, a theocentrism, a lived theocentrism, which is very, very different from our way of experiencing religion. On an ideological level, one can say, yes, it's a monotheism. But if you know, and if you read just the books, maybe you can deduct this from the books. But if you know personally Islamic people, you just feel that it's not the same. That for them, as it appears also, by the way, in the collective symbolism, like the minarets and the five calls to prayer every day and so forth, it is an experienced reality that God is the center of everything and not man. And this is the point I want to make. It's not the human being and his desires. It's not the human being and his need of salvation. It's not the human being and his need of psychological welfare or health. And this is what's for us so difficult to grasp, coming from our Western background. Because we are, this is absolutely evident, we are anthropocentric, and this means we are egocentric. My life is, to a certain extent, the center of the world. And when my life disappears, the world, to a certain extent, disappears because I do not exist anymore. In the core of the Muslim perception, it would not be expressed that way, because it is somewhere experienced that God is the ultimate level of reality. So if I disappear, reality does not disappear. And my disappearance is not such a big deal. And this, of course, can also let us understand that in the Islamic perception of human life is not such a big deal. It can explain why in the Islamic world we have the suicide bombers. Because the individual life, including the one of the one who kills himself, is not the center of reality. Now, this is of course a shadow aspect of what I'm saying here, but it is very important to feel the connection between this very dramatic shadow aspect, of course, and the core perception of Islam. There is one symbol in Islam which expresses this very well, and which is Mecca. And as you know, in Mecca there is the center of Mecca. There is the Kaaba. The Kaaba is an empty box, to put it bluntly. It's a big empty box, with maybe in a corner a little stone, a black stone, who is supposed to be a meteorite. So an empty box with maybe a little in a corner a little testimony from the cosmos. And all the mosques, as you know, are oriented towards this Kaaba, all over the world. Towards this void. Towards this, I would say to a certain extent, this nothingness, which does not, in the contrary of our nothingness, because we are still so addicted to meaning, which does not despair the people who experience that. Now, of course, we have a very dramatic event, which will be again remembered tomorrow, which, as you know, is 9/11, where those two perceptions of reality, the egocentric Western one and this theocentric Islamic one, have collided in an absolutely dramatic and, of course, for the victims, absolutely tragic way. I would just want to read you about this, and I think it's better it comes from an American. This short passage written by James Hillman, this excellent Jungian colleague, what he wrote about ground zero. This is in the book Jungian Reflections on September 11. It has been published a year after the event. And I would say this passage says a lot and sums also up to a certain extent what I wanted to say. Is it not strange, I quote, is it not strange that ground zero, that the ground is named zero? Zero, an Arabic gift to our Western languages and calculations. Zero from zifr originally meant naught, a nothing, an emptiness without content. Zifr, the Arabic word zifr, also became sifr, the enigmatic sign that must be decoded. In physics, a zero refers to a point from which measurements can proceed, either ascending or descending, neither positive or negative in itself. And the symbolic round circle in the Hindu mathematics from which the sign came represents beginning and end, both fullness, purna, and void, sunya. Number beyond number, essentially uncalculable, of measurable possibility. That devastated earth in the depths of lower Manhattan is the zero ground of possibility, emptied of all what was and filled with all possible fantasies. End of quote. This passage really shows that it could be that we have here a highly, highly important symbol, which has become, of course, a tragic event. Or a tragic event which has become a symbol, both ways. Of a ending of a certain type of evolution. And with this, I will come to my last point, which is also synchronicity, synchronistic dimension in reality, with all what I said, is that nature is putting now an ending to our civilization. It is objectively a fact that we cannot go on growing the way we did so far. But this means also that the premises of this growth have to be put into question. Economic premises, psychological premises, technological premises. But there is an objective limit. And this objective limit is also to a certain extent a void. Because if we say it cannot go on like that, then immediately comes the question, yeah, but so what? Yeah, we have no answer. This is the present collective situation we are in. This so what without an answer. That's why this theme of the void, of the nothingness, is such a, I would say, present-day collective symbol. We are in a huge question without answer. And synchronistically, Islam represents simply something which is hurting us, but somewhere fitting with this question. There are now. Do you still have some time? Or
Yeah, a couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes.
Then I think we take our break.
Right. That we have come to a limit is, I just want to say this, is also very much understandable. Limit, objective limit imposed to us by nature. If you consider just this one fact, I have it here, that since the beginning of history and 1950, humanity has used so many resources. At the beginning of its history in 1950. Between 1950 and the year 2000, humanity has used the same amount of resources. If you just think a second, that all the resources which humanity has used between its beginning and 1950 is the same quantity of resources than what humanity has used between 1950 and the year and about today. The calculations were made till the year 2000. That makes no difference. So in other words, since about 50 or 100 years, we are in an explosion. We are in a situation of an explosion. And this is very important to acknowledge, that it is an explosive situation we are in and not a development. And this is illustrated by all the lines, all the parameters which have asymptotic curves. Use of water per individual, use of soil per individual, use of air per individual, and then the use of natural resources, animals, whatever, plants, all asymptotic curves. This just gives us also a more physical feeling of this nothingness I wanted to speak about. I thank you very much, and we will discuss later.
Maybe we could take our break now. I'll just crouch down here behind. We could take our break now for 10 or 15 minutes and then come back with questions from the audience. And between Bernard and myself, we can discuss and bring Tom in for some discussion in the third session. Does that make sense to you all?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, Steve, so. Okay.
Great. We'll get started in just a moment. Question before I do.
Okay.
Do you want us to spend the last 45 minutes in open discussion mostly, or do you have any more presented material that you'd like to cover at some point?
I think we'd like to go into a dialogue discussion mode. I've got a couple of questions I can ask Bernard, but if you have some questions that the audience has sent to you, maybe we could turn to those as well. And if Tom wants to get into it, or maybe Tom would like to wait until this afternoon and say what he has to then, whichever way.
Yeah, excellent. Just an update: we have 160 people, live signed in. So virtually everybody who registered is participating live, which was surprising to us. But we just checked the main center, and so we have a large audience out there. That large audience, however, are all introverted.
Hi, audience.
They're all pretty introverted, and I've just got 2 or 3 email questions so far. So for that large audience, we know you're watching. We've checked our records. So do start sending a few more questions. I do have a couple, though, I want to ask. And I'd like to start with Sonoma. Tom, are you guys back in the room? I was wondering if you have some questions there, and also let us know how many people are in the room there, just to get a sense of who's present.
34, 35?
Well, we have 34 or 35 people in the room here, and it's very lively and very stimulated by the presentations so far. I did have the feeling that Murray and Bernard were speaking into the void, and that I felt badly for them because it's nice to have human beings that you're talking to as well as a screen. So
Well, we can see you.
We can see you.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, here we are.
It's not the void. It's not the void.
Yeah, hello.
Go ahead, Ray.
Hello, That's very good.
I have a comment I'd like to start with, which may open up a whole range of questions, and it's sort of it's pasting together what Murray started with and what Bernard ended with, which is that we began with Jung's vision of Europe being covered in blood in 1913, which by the end of Bernard's talk seemed to me like child's play compared to what Bernard was seeing emerging in the collective unconscious. Wotan seems like a little spoiled god to me compared to this vision of nothingness in the cosmos. But I felt as though both Jung's early vision and what Bernard is, I think, in his radically beautiful description, they're both coming from sort of the deepest level of an archetypal perception of the collective unconscious, and that's just an opening comment. It's a compliment to both of you also.
Thank you. No.
Well, we had a lunch together yesterday, and we discussed what we'd each say and what we expect you will say later, Tom. I know that I've heard Bernard speak some of these ideas over the years of our relationship and various settings. He really takes a very broad, very long historical perspective, from the ancient Egyptians to the present time. And it's kind of, it's a historical view of a broad sweep, Toynbee-like, the rising and falling of civilizations. Now, Jung took a similar view of history, certainly in Ion, looking at the last 2,000 years and the development of the Christian era. So this is a part of you could say, the Jungian way of thinking in these very big picture scenarios. And I'm expecting that Tom and what you do this afternoon is going to be more local, more immediate, the case of Obama. But I would like to fit Obama into this picture somehow and get to the immediate situation. The day before 9/11, I know that's a very hot subject in the States right now. That and some of the things that Bernard said about changing course, the need to change course on a massive civilizational, global level. How can a leader take hold of something like that? And who would the leader be? And I put forward the idea of, Jung's ideal of leadership, the rainmaker, and in the intermission, Bernard said, well, that's magical thinking. Those kind of things don't really happen. I'm more of a magical thinking type guy, I guess. I think, some people like the Dalai Lama and these world figures who really do communicate a much bigger picture, do have an influence. And some kind of leader like that, not the leader of a nation probably, but the leader of humanity is going to have to emerge somehow in this crisis that we're in, this explosion that Bernard is talking about. What do you think about that?
For me, the story of the rainmaker and the leaders of this type, which you call leaders, they are prophetic, in fact. He indicates, this image and this story indicates in advance a possible evolution. But it cannot not be a literal leader. Mm-hmm. because the political concrete leader. Because if you look at the story of the civilizations, the change of civilizations are happening like the movement of the tectonic plates on our planet. Mm-hmm. And there you can have prophets who can feel in advance in which direction it is going, and it might very well be something like that, but they are not agents for the transformation. And in my understanding, we have had in the 20th century already quite a few prophetic movements. I mean, for instance, May '68, the '70s in the States, the hippie movement. They immediately they had very little political impact on the long run, but they were very significant because they were announcing the huge crisis we are in now. And when I speak about this this explosion we are in, they felt it already, and now everybody talks about it. At that time they were considered to be folkloric, but now one just sees that the limit is objective. So I would put this type of leadership into the prophetic area, and not into the kingly area, to speak in Old Testament categories.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think I would think the prophet or the diagnostician, and I think you're a diagnostician. I think you look at the symptoms and you read the picture and you can say, this belongs to the picture of the crisis. That's a diagnosis. Where does the prescription come from? Where is the king? Where is somebody who stands up and says, look, folks, and I think people try to do this. The UN tries to do it. Dalai Lama tries to do it. Maybe a collection of leaders will say, we really need to change our thinking so fundamentally. We don't know exactly what the new patterns will be, but it can't, this isn't sustainable. Al Gore is trying to do things like that. I mean, there are people popping up. And somewhere, somebody's got to say, well, where do we go? That's what a leader does, isn't it? A leader says, well, let's not go in this direction. Let's go in this direction now, and can convince you that that is not only a good idea, but it's the only idea that will ensure survival. I don't know. I look for leadership somewhere. And I think Obama, a figure like Obama, certainly promised that at the beginning, and when he came to Berlin and spoke in Berlin, and there were, 500,000 people in the streets or something, it was very impressive. And I think he galvanized a kind of global idea of leadership, but then he gets, of course, caught and bogged down in local politics in the United States. So he can't be a world leader. He won't get reelected to the presidency. That's a real dilemma.
I disagree with Jung's model of individuation for a political leader, because, or even for an idea of how the world gets transformed. And the reason I disagree with that is that I don't think the ego-self axis is enough. I think that from the point of view of the self, as Bernard really spoke about in a way, what is coming from the self, about the void at this point, that's a very deep, and it strikes me as accurate perception of where we are. But I think the leader, a political leader, needs to have the intermediate realm of the culture, the local, and the divisions within populations very much as a part of his being and what he's speaking to. And so I would add in that ego-self axis, I would add ego culture or ego world self, because ego self, I don't think it's enough to go sit in a hut and get your world in order. I think it's a wonderful story about individuation, but it's not a good story about leadership in a political sense. It may be a wonderful story about leadership in a religious sense, about the need to bring things into order in oneself and perhaps in the world in some way. But I don't think it serves us well as Jungians to use that as a model for talking about political leadership.
Steve, do you have some other questions coming in from your side? We don't want to exclude the audience.
Right, exactly. Right. Let me ask a few. I'm going to start with an email question, then open the floor to anybody here in Asheville and then Wilmington for a specific question. The email question is from Jude in Woodstock, New York, and it says, "So glad you are tackling this topic when there is such a dearth of this crucial conversation. The psyche of those who dominate our increasingly unstable and unsustainable world. One fascination of mine is how many U.S. presidents have father issues, absent fathers mostly. Clinton, Bush, Obama for starters. Any thoughts on this?" Signed, Jude. That can be for really any of you all, but any thoughts on that question?
The absent father. I was very impressed with, I must say, with Obama's book, Dreams from My Father, where he went in search of his African father and his roots. And what so much impressed me about that was that his sensitivity to psychological issues in his own life, in the world around him, his dreams. It isn't that his father was absent or father figures were absent. I look on the issue of the father in a more general way. I've had a good personal father, very loving father, but at a certain age, I realized my father was limited, and I had to find another father figure. And fortunately, the culture provided that. I had some wonderful teachers. There were other male figures in my environment who had a wider reach and a way of speaking and presenting themselves that I found very interesting and attractive, and that really were very inspiring to me. So, and in analysis, I found another kind of a father. I think the father principle is the thing that coming to Tom Singer's point about cultures, that the culture puts forward an image of the father archetype, if you will, or the father, the good enough father, who exemplifies certain qualities that the young people can identify as useful and positive, and idealize them and form themselves around these exemplars. So I look on the father as really a cultural object and a cultural image, not only a personal one. It certainly does help to have a good personal father, especially in the very early years of life. But after that, you need more than that. You need father figures in the culture who can lead your imagination in certain directions that you would be without that. Bernard?
I think it's a very interesting question in that sense that when there is a father problematics, I don't know Mr. Obama, and neither do I know Mr. Bush personally and their story, but let's say they would have a father problematics on the individual level, not good enough father, missing father, or whatever, or too strong father. There is the danger when they receive the messianic projections, and these messianic projections are now really in the air, in the crisis situation which we try to speak about, that they want to be better fathers than their own father for the nation. Galvanized by the massive projections they receive from the collective. So there is, of course, a danger that, and I would say maybe probably with your former president this was the case, that he wants to be an especially tough leader. But receiving, not just only because he has his father in the background, but all the other president, but also because he receives these very great messianic expectations from the population, from the collective. So that's, I just wanted to add this.
Got a burning question from Steve in Asheville, which I'm also going to ask to Tom later. But Murray and Bernard, question I'd like to ask is if the situation presented, and by some bizarre token that President Obama invited you to have a beer with him, sit down at a pub, and you had an hour to spend with Obama, not that the question will take that long to answer, what crucial items do you want to make sure to get across to President Obama to make him either aware of these items? What would be on your agenda of, boy, I'd really want to tell President Obama X over that hour with him? I know it's putting you on the spot, but I'm going to do it anyway.
First, have an advice.
First of all, I'd ask for a glass of wine rather than beer. But do you have an answer to that, Bernard?
No. Honestly.
I would advise him to be himself as much as he possibly can. I think he does a good job. I really like the way Obama comes across and pretty much everything he's done. But really to be himself, to spend enough time with himself, enough time with his family, to not take too seriously what everybody tells him, and I'm sure he has lots of advisors who help him with that, because you get so many projections, as Bernard said. Positive aren't good for you and negative aren't good for you. He really has to find a direction in himself and in his own thinking and in his own feeling, and stay true to that. And when you look at great leaders, I think of Gandhi, Churchill, people like that, they just stayed true to what they knew and who they were, and just kept going with that. And if you aren't reelected, you aren't reelected. Don't worry too much about the politics. That would be my advice. I think he's a very attractive personality, and probably people will like him and reelect him. But the country is so divided and split along racial lines and political lines, ideological lines, that I don't think he can look outside for his cues. He has to look in. He has to look inward and ground himself in his own knowing and knowledge of himself. And this is how I look on that model of the leadership, the rainmaker. It's not so much the magic of it. I think there is some magic involved in it, but spending some time meditating, introverting, drawing mandalas, staying close to yourself, and coming out of that with your own ideas and your own feeling. That's what I think a leader should do, and I think Obama's pretty good at that, actually.
Well, thank you. Let's turn over to Sonoma, and Tom, if anybody there has a question or two, go ahead and ask, and then I'll see if Asheville audience has a question right after that. But go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. Laurel's going to, yes, Laurel.
Oh, that's fine. Or Laurel. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Bernard, I thought your comments about the 20th century and the void were interesting. Some of us were talking about it. I was reminded of Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, where he wrote it earlier in the century, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. It's as if in Western culture and also in Islam, well, maybe not Islam, I won't go there, the real has been demolished. We can have the image of 9/11 in the building, the demolishing of the structures of our society. So my question is, it's interesting that you call that a nullity or a void. Maybe it's a presence. It's funny, the image that comes to my mind is that of the sun god. We might even call him the death god. That is the orb of the sun journeying now underground in total blackness. That's all I'm going to say.
No, I mean, I have nothing much to add. I just think that your comment is very good. I mean, that you give a very good another illustration which is very adequate, with the sun god being under the not visible right now, and this. And this, I mean, if you look, at the disappearances of civilizations, they always went through a phase a little bit like the one we are facing now. If you take, you always had apocalyptic literatures during those times. The end of antiquity, the beginning of Christianity was full of apocalyptic end of world fantasies. A whole tremendous literature at that time. Around the age 1000, when the first Middle Age was ceasing, the same. You had apocalyptic tendencies. End of world was coming. So this consciousness disappearing, the sun going under, is a very, very good image. And I would say, just to make a connection with your question about Obama, that the big danger now the political leaders can be in, if they think they could solve the problems in the whole amplitude in which they are in fact constellated. If they do this, they destroy themselves. If they accept that they can try to manage the crisis in which we are as best as possible, then they can survive. To say it in a very simple way, because if you look at the end of the Roman Empire, it's very interesting to see there was one emperor after the other that failed, because at one point they tried to keep the empire together, and it was not possible anymore. And then afterwards there had to be a period of chaos, of destructuration of the empire before the golden Middle Age started to come. But I mean, this is hypothesis, but I mean, it seems that it's meaningful also according to your reactions, that it's not completely besides the point, that we are in a major shift of paradigma. And they're the political leaders. Yeah.
Oh, I'd like to add to that and bring it back to the question of Obama's personal father, because I think one of the interesting things about sort of the mystery, if you will, or the absence in an ongoing way of his personal father, and sort of the questions of his origins, where does he really come from, which have been the source of an enormous projections, mostly negative, but at the same time they sort of open him up to the mystery of not quite knowing where he comes from. That can add to the projections, but it means he's really from everywhere and nowhere as a mythological figure, behind which is the father sort of invisible, or the setting sun father. He's having to respond to this out of his own being, as Murray, I think, very wisely would counsel him. The father isn't present in the way that George Bush's father was, and I think that actually serves him well for this time, even though it invites all sorts of negative projections about shadowy origins.
Thanks, Thomas. Great. Yeah.
One of the mics and press the button.
I've got a few more email questions. Let me first ask, though, Asheville, any questions from the audience here in Asheville you'd like to ask our presenters?
Yeah, I've got a question.
We have another.
Okay. Let's do one in Asheville, and then we'll go to Sonoma for a question. Go ahead, Asheville.
I'm assuming that Mr. Obama does not really have an analytical psychology background. Maybe not familiar with the collective projections and all the terms I'm using. How important is it that he understands these things?
Could you all hear the question?
Yes. I'm not so sure he doesn't have. I'm not so sure he doesn't have some understanding of that if you read his book. He's widely read. Jungian psychology has really permeated the culture to a large extent. I don't think the idea of collective projections is a very esoteric subject anymore. He probably has read it in magazines, if not in, the collected works of C.G. Jung. But I think he has read widely. He's a very intelligent man. He's been at good universities, California, New York, Harvard. lived in Chicago. He's been around, and I think it's enough in the culture that people at that level do know something about collective projections and the danger of them. You know, these symbols that pop up during times of crisis. Jung talked in the Wotan essay, you know, when the libido regresses to these old riverbeds, symbols get generated, and those symbols can be very dangerous if you just take them on as a mantle and try to live them. Then you become as possessed as the population by the archetypal energy behind that. On the other hand, every leader is a symbolic figure and has to be, and has to know how to use the symbols of his office. And so there's a kind of, I mean, manipulation's a bad word, but let's say use of the symbolic value of the presidency, of the White House, of the Oval Office. All the presidents do that. You can do it more or less consciously. The bully pulpit. He has an exceptional power in that position, a symbolic power. And so I think a leader has to know how to use the symbolic to his own advantage, or the advantage of his ideas, his direction, where he's trying to take people. And it generates opposition and resistance as he's getting, which is good. In democracy, there should be resistance. If everybody's going along, it's even more dangerous. That's really, then I think people get too inflated that they really have the right direction and know everything. And so the resistance is a very good thing if it doesn't go over the edge, if it doesn't go too far. But to hear other points of view and realize that reality is complex and no single person knows everything, it's very useful. Another danger of leadership is that they can be surrounded by people who don't give them the bad news. And I guess I would advise Obama also to listen to your critics, and as much as you can take, and take that on board. But realize that reality is made up of a lot of oppositions, and the symbol might be able to bring some of those opposites together, but not always all of them. So I think the use of the symbolic is very important in a leader's position.
The questions are stacking up now, which is a good thing. Why don't we take one question from Sonoma? There's one in Asheville, and then I've got a couple email questions that we might use. But go ahead, Sonoma. One question, then back to Asheville.
Let's see, a few days after the World Trade Center... Can you hear me? A few days after the World Trade Center fell, creating Ground Zero, Thich Nhat Hanh said that we must listen and listen and listen again, implying that the tendency would be for us to act or react. We did. And then a few weeks after Obama was inaugurated, a friend of a friend of a friend was at the dinner table and talking about the food thing. Michael Pollan relayed this to me, saying, well, what do you think you should do about the food crisis in the United States? And Obama looked at his wife, and I said, this might be your task. The 60s really did, according to Noam Chomsky, produce a powerful and unstoppable effect, which was feminism. The circle of zero is the symbol for the feminine. My question is, more ancient than Muhammad was the inside of the Buddha. At the center is the void. We come to and go from emptiness. Much more ancient than Muhammad. In the story of the Rainmaker, how do you read the first step? Build me a little hut on the edge of your village.
It's a very complex question. Would you like to address some of it?
Honestly, I must confess I don't understand the question.
You have to build the hut. Who builds the hut?
Okay, the hut.
There's no leader that builds the hut.
Yeah, so he doesn't build his own hut. He asks the community to build him a hut on the edge. So, yeah, that's a very provocative question. What would it mean for a leader to camp out on the edge? Now, we aren't talking about a political leader. The political leader has invited the spiritual leader in, and the spiritual leader is a shaman, and so I think I guess the Thich Nhat Hanh is also on the edge. You know, you get people on the edge of power who come up with the right answers, who come up with the solutions because they aren't directly involved in the power issues. If you're directly involved in the power issues, they tend to consume you. My advice to Obama would be take a little time out and sit on the edge. You know, find yourself a hut. Go to Camp David without all your advisors around you and listen to yourself. Listen to your own deepest voice. That's what it means to go to the edge. It's to get out of the collective, to get out of all this noise that's being made, all these cries for help, all this, you know, everybody wants a moment of your attention and wants an answer. You've got to get out of that and sit on the edge for a little while, 3 days. You know, that's symbolic period of time for death and rebirth. And let yourself sink into another dimension. Out of that will come something, will come a voice, will come an insight, will come a renewal. And this sun going under, you know, that we'll talk about that in the next seminar with Andreas Schweitzer, who's written a whole book about the night sea journey of the sun, the passage through the netherworld. There are crises in that, but it is basically a journey of renewal. There's a decline, there's a death, there's a going down under, but it is a renewal mystery. In the 6th hour out of the 12, there is the mystery of a rebirth and a renewal. It's a kind of initiation moment in the life of the sun god. So going to the edge, sitting in that hut, is getting out of it for a little while and going deep. Jung talks about the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths in the Red Book. He takes some time out, maybe more than a political leader could afford, to go into the depths, and that's where he gets his answers for the rest of his life. So this hut at the edge is very important. Having a place at the edge of things, getting out of the mainstream for a little while, going into the quiet place, sitting by yourself, incubating, meditating.
Can I just add something concerning the gentleman said something interesting about Buddha, the void, being much older than Mohammed's revelation, or what revelation he received. Yes, this is for sure true, but it's not. It's interesting for a Muslim. It would be not contradictory at all what we are saying, because in fact the basic intuition in Islam is that humanity has to remember that originally God has created the human beings. It's a remembrance, it's a zikr. And so all the people, even if they lived 2,000 years before Muhammad, who had this intuition, they belong I would say for Muslims who are differentiated, who are not too simple-minded, they belong to this humanity who remembers where it comes from. And the void in the Buddhist understanding is very close to this to this ground of being, which the Muslims call Allah. And it's not a coincidence that one of the best books written about one of the most famous Islamic philosophers, Ibn al-Arabi, was written by a Japanese Buddhist Zen specialist. This is not a coincidence. I forgot, unfortunately, her name. It's a lady. I think Izutsu is her name. And this is the best book about Ibn al-Arabi, and she is herself a Zen Buddhist master. So this is no coincidence that she was the author of this. So anyway. Just to say that there is this ground of being background which you made reference to, and yeah.
Let me ask a question from Asheville, and then if you have time, an email question. And if you still have time, we'll go back to Sonoma for one more, but it's getting a little bit close to the time. Go ahead, Len. You had a question?
This is more of a follow-up with the earlier question from Asheville. It seems to me quite likely that a black man in America would be very aware of the experience of projection upon him. And with that as a preamble, may I ask, what do you think are the deep and dry riverbeds of the American experience of being black, and how does that, are there any specific things that the current president is likely to be subject to that are deep, dry riverbeds of our cultural experience and collective experience?
I was thinking about that actually in advance of this, because with Germany being such a coherent, homogeneous culture, it was easy to reach back into its history for the old gods, the old pagan god Wotan, who was the chief of the pack in German history. In American experience, you've got such a collection of people from so many different parts of the world. So, and Obama is a mixture. He's got his roots in Africa on the one side, so there would be an African riverbed, and the African experience in America, which has deep riverbeds in the experience of slavery, but also in its religious expressions that partly come from Africa and are partly Christian, and resulted in the music and everything that's so characteristically American, blues and jazz and so on. That's one riverbed. You could say African heritage, and what would come out of that. And on the other side, he's Midwestern. He has what was his mother, Scandinavian or something. And so he's because and he lived in a Muslim household for a while with a stepfather in Indonesia. He's subject to several riverbeds. What these riverbeds are, what the archetypes really are. There was a very good lecture in Montreal, by the way, by a German Wrestler was his name, and he came to the conclusion, if you look at archetypal theory, where do archetypes come from? How are they passed on? They're really passed on by cultures rather than by genes. He says the genes, it's not possible for the genes to pass on such complex material as we speak of as archetypal images and the gods and so on, mythology. And so the means of transmission is cultural. And there are certain genetic predispositions, but the content is passed through culture. And somebody like Obama is so thoroughly American in the sense that he is a mixture of cultures that have come to America from abroad, from the European side and from the African side. Those were the two main sources for a long time. Now, of course, there are a lot of Asians, and then there were the Native Americans before that. So America has so many small riverbeds that it's very hard to put your finger on one, the way you could with the Germans or you could with the Japanese. These homogeneous societies that have a long history of a religious tradition and so on. It's quite singular and tribal.
What about the possibility of a black man being a symbol of power, of a primitive nature, that also brings with it a threat, given that the historical antecedents are of people under subjugation who could at any moment rise up? Is that a kind of a dry riverbed that's deeply embedded in our American experience?
Racist riverbed. Well, I mean, I think you can see regression to that in some expressions of some people in the United States. I don't live in the States now, but I hear from my daughter and I hear from the media, that there is quite a bit of agitation from the racist segment of the population. And so, yeah, you could say that is a riverbed, not very old either. I mean, somebody told me they were in one of those southern states recently, was it Mississippi or Alabama, where there's still segregated water fountains. There's a colored water fountain and a white water fountain. And maybe it's not used in that way anymore, but they're still intact in this small town down there. So that's a riverbed that can be sourced pretty easily. I don't look on Obama as a black president. I look on Obama as an American president who has a mixture of genetic material and cultural material flowing together in him, and that's what makes him so interesting and so unusual. If he were only a black president, it would be a different story. It would be a Jesse Jackson or Martin Luther King or somebody like that. I think would be a different personality, different makeup. But he bridges and conjoins riverbeds, you could say. I think that gives him remarkable strength, that he has several sources.
Well, we're almost out of time for our break to occur. Tom, you look like you were going to pop out of your seat briefly earlier, so I might give you the last word. You've got
Tom's wants to do that sometimes.
Well, I do tend to pop out of my seat. I have so many different thoughts. I think in response to the question of the kind of archetypal riverbed that Obama could stimulate as a, not just in a positive way, but in that Wotan kind of way. During the election, and I will be speaking about this when I talk, certainly when Reverend Wright got up and talked about AIDS being transmitted intentionally from white to black America to eliminate them, and that 9/11 was what America deserved with the chickens coming home to roost, there was a tremendous uproar. It almost cost Obama the nomination, because from the side of black power and the angry black man, many of whom came to Reverend Wright's defense, there was tremendous suspicion of Obama as being too much of an Uncle Tom. And I will speak about Obama's Philadelphia speech, which I think was the critical speech of his early candidacy. But I think there are very powerful, deep, perhaps the oldest riverbeds in America have to do with racism and anti-black sentiment. And they're virulent, and although they may be quite regressive, I agree with Murray, they're very present, and an enormous challenge to Obama, whether he's seen as black or some, very interesting mixture of a lot of different things. The other comment I'd like to make just briefly has to do with the role of Jungian psychology in relation to politicians and political life. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and a fair amount of time dealing with politicians. And what always amazes me, as much as it sounds as though we're speaking a similar language and we have similar perceptions about human nature, there's a huge gulf between psychologists and politicians. And we don't speak the same language at all. And it's a tremendous mistake to think that analytical psychologists have anything special to contribute to political life other than the wonderful words of wisdom of Murray, which is what we know about, which is the need for introversion and taking time to find one's own bearings. But other than that, we're just like everybody else. That's what I'd like to say. That's why I was popping.
Okay, well, with that teaser of what we're going to hear from Tom in a couple hours, a couple real quick things I'd like to say. One is, Tom, I don't know if it's possible to increase the light shining on your desk. It's a little bit dark on the monitors here. If you have any time over the break to increase the illumination, that'd be great. If not, we'll get by with it fine enough.
The sun hasn't risen yet in Sonoma.
We got you for 5:45.
It hasn't risen yet. It may not rise.
Otherwise, we will take a 1-hour break, and we'll reintroduce, Tom at that point. Murray and Bernard, two things. One, I'd like to say that you should have the links emailed to you. I emailed that this morning. So for you, it's a dinner break, and you'll probably go home. If you do care to watch from your home, if you can get the computers set up right, feel free to email us. We'll be interested to hear any email comments you might have, and if we can get time to present those, we will. Otherwise, I really want to thank the two of you. You've done a fabulous job today, and thank you once again.
Danke.